Thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's great to see such a big crowd. I'm Elizabeth Goldman, the director of Burbank Public Library, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's program, which features Mark Thompson. He's the author of Enough Said, What's Gone Wrong with the Language of Politics. It is election season, and in election season, the language of politics is all around us. Whether we consume the news through traditional newspapers, television, radio, websites, or social media, we have access to more viewpoints, perspectives, and opinions than ever before. Yet amid all this rush of content, it's easy to feel we've lost perspective. Over the course of a 30-year career at the BBC, and more recently as president and CEO of the New York Times Company, Mr. Thompson has observed how political discourse has changed. This evening, he will explore what he sees as a widening gap between those in political power and the public due to misuse and misunderstanding of language. The discussion also serves as a reminder of the importance of you, citizens, taking the time to sort through this rhetoric, make thoughtful decisions, and vote. If you leave here tonight wanting to know more, besides purchasing a copy of the book and reading it thoroughly, please also remember that the library can provide you with access to a variety of books and articles on all sorts of topics, and we can help direct you to trustworthy sources to help figure out what's real out there. Also, I just want to mention, because people voting is personally very important to me, I feel strongly about it, that we do have a presidential election coming up. The last day to register to vote in California is Monday, October 24th. If you have any questions about how to do that, our staff are happy to help with that as well. So please keep all of that in mind, come up with some great questions for our author, and join me in welcoming Mark Thompson for what I'm sure will prove to be a thought-provoking evening of conversation about what civic engagement means in the digital era.
Thank you, Elizabeth. What a great privilege to come to this library and speak to you all. Let me begin with a question. What happens when a political language fails? When the rage and the incomprehension boil over, and when we run out of a common vocabulary and sufficient trust in each other's words to be able to sit down and work through what unites us and what divides us? Don't expect too much comfort from history. From the fall of Athens to the rise of totalitarianism, observers from Thucydides to George Orwell have associated a breakdown in public language, or rhetoric to use its traditional name, with the failure of democracy, loss of freedom, civil strife, with tyranny. So let's talk about 2016. In my country, we've just had a supposedly once and for all national debate about the UK's place in Europe, which descended into what the chairman of one parliamentary select committee, in my view, rightly called, quote, an arm race of ever more lurid claim and counterclaim made by both sides. It was, in my experience, the worst public debate on any topic in my professional career. In continental Europe, anti-politicians, Beppe Grillo in Italy is a good example. Populists and extremists are gaining ground in many countries. The ultra-rightist Norbert Hofer is within millimetres of the Austrian presidency. Marine Le Pen polling very nicely, thank you, in the run-up to next year's French presidential race. And in this country, we're witnessing a presidential race which often seems to be mainly about language, about telling it like it is, or cheating and lying, depending on your political taste. And almost everywhere, whether in the debating chamber, on prime time, or on a smartphone in your pocket, there's a sense of a public discourse which is losing its power to explain, its power to reconcile, or indeed its power to express anything beyond vitriol and division. So that is what my book's about. How we got here, what the underlying causes are of the fractures and failures in our language, and what, if anything, we can do to put things right. The trends I'm talking about have many different social, economic, and political causes. But public language, the language we use when we discuss politics or policy, when we make our case in court, or when we try and persuade anyone of almost anything in a public context, seems to me to be at the heart of the matter. Indeed, I believe we're living through what amounts to a crisis in public language. This crisis is playing out in many ways, but perhaps the most important way is the failure of conventional political rhetoric in almost every Western country. For many voters, the gap between the claims and promises of political leaders and what they take to be the facts on the ground, facts about inequality, globalization, the crash of 2008, the facts about immigration, about the West's unhappy wars in the Middle East and much, much else besides, that gap has become simply too wide. Now, you can certainly argue whether this disillusion is justified or not, but the disillusion itself has become a central political reality. But the death of a political rhetoric is not like a royal succession with the crown passing smoothly from one monarch to the next. We're living through a disputed interregnum, where many people, including many politicians, refuse to accept that the old queen is dead, and strange new pretenders to the throne are popping up everywhere. Anti-politicians like Grillo and Donald Trump, mavericks from within existing political structures like Ted Cruz or Britain's Boris Johnson, each with their own rhetorical recipe for fame and glory. Now, of course, these pretenders would deny that they were in the rhetoric business at all. They mention the word rhetoric, it's only in the context of the public language of the establishment, which they hate so much. I'll give you a quote from Silvio Berlusconi, who I see as one of the very first of the anti-politicians, a kind of proto-Trump. And one of the things Silvio said back in the 1990s was, quote, "If there's one thing I can't abide, it's rhetoric. I'm only interested in what needs to get done." But I don't need to tell the people in this room that this itself is a classic move in the game of rhetoric. It's what Mark Antony is up to in the Friends, Roman and Countrymen speech in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. So Mark Antony says to the crowd, the kind of rather angry and confused Roman crowd, quote, "I am no orator, as Brutus is, but as you know me all, a plain, blunt man." Does that remind you of anyone? In the right circumstances, this kind of anti-rhetoric can be the most persuasive rhetoric of all. But what's interesting is, like any other form of public language, we can unpack it and we can try and figure out what makes it tick. So let me read you a passage from the book, and I tell you now, I'm going to have to begin with an apology. You're going to have to forgive me. I've spent hours in front of the mirror practicing saying huge and unbelievable, but I can't really crack the accent, so I'll give it to you in the Queen's English. Here is Mr. Trump addressing a stadium of supporters in Dallas in September last year, September 2015. "I made a beautiful speech. I thought it was wonderful. Everything was fine. About a week and a half later, they attacked me. In other words, they went through, and then they lied. They made it up. And they talked about, I was talking about illegal immigration. We have to stop illegal immigration. We have to do it." Cheers and applause. "Have to do it. Have to do it." Audience cry, "USA, USA, USA, USA." And when I hear some of the people that I'm running against, including the Democrats, "We have to build a wall, folks. We have to build a wall. And a wall works. All you have to do is to go to Israel and say, 'How is your wall working?' Walls work." Okay, that's Donald. This is me now coming. So you can deconstruct this. You can try and figure out what's going on. The super short sentences are there to emphasize certainty and determination. And they seem very crude, but they build up layer upon layer, a bit like bricks in a wall themselves, towards a conclusion and a kind of emotional climax. Students of rhetoric call this style parataxis, and it's the way that generals and dictators have always spoken to distinguish themselves from the cavilling civilians they mean to sweep aside. If you go to Wikipedia, it quotes Julius Caesar's very famous summary of his victory in the Battle of Zela, "Veni, vidi, vici," I came, I saw, I conquered, as a classical example of parataxis. But today, listeners are more likely to associate it with the successful entrepreneur or the CEO. And we're in the digital age, so parataxis is particularly useful today. Donald Trump's parataxis is almost infinitely compressible, as his intuitive mastery of the micro-rhetorical world of Twitter shows. Quote, lightweight Marco Rubio was working hard last night. The problem is, he's a choker, and once a choker, always a choker. Mr. Meltdown. Lightweight, choker, Mr. Meltdown. This is personal in every sense of the word, and written personally on the spur of the moment. If the last choker is actually spelt chocker, it's been miskeyed. And at this point, Donald was either in the daytime dictating in real time, shouting probably at one of his aides to kind of get it down and get it out. After 8 o'clock, they give the phone to him, and he does it himself. But so it seems very, very, instant, not even properly spelled. But it contains no fewer than 3 different summaries of Donald Trump's view of Marco Rubio, each of which is individually retweetable and extensible and so forth. Notice the alliteration in the passage, all those W's, walls work. All you have to go to Israel is, how is your wall working? Walls work. He's got all sorts of, and he may well not be fully aware of what he's doing, quite sophisticated ways of expressing himself in a short, punchy, memorable way. But there's a trade-off here. What's happening is impact, energy, and a sense, because it is kind of coming out. Certainly at this stage, this is a year ago, and this was true deep into the primaries, and still sometimes happens today. It feels like it's completely off the cuff. So it's got a much more natural feel than a conventional politician's carefully prepared, pre-focus groups remarks. In some ways, with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, we're seeing 2 extreme forms of absolute preparation and shooting from the hip against, so 2 remarkable contrasts of different rhetorical styles. But something's been lost, and what's been lost to me is a sense of explanatory power and ability to explain what's really going on. If you ask Donald Trump today what's his economic policy for the country, he says he's got 3 policies: jobs, jobs, jobs. It's very effective. It says, I'm a businessman, I know how to create wealth, I know how to create jobs for Americans. Vote for me and you'll get it. And he does that essentially with one word, jobs, repeated 3 times. Doesn't tell you how he's going to do it. And it doesn't help voters understand and critique his policy proposals and options relative to anyone else's. Twitter seems to have influenced Trump's public oratory. So that world and the endless overnight retweets. And he sometimes reminds me of someone who has found something they don't like in a newspaper and is running a circle around it with a biro so they don't forget it. I'll give you one last Trumpism. Here he is on President Obama, quite recently. He's the founder of ISIS. He's the founder of ISIS. He's the founder. He founded ISIS. And I would say that the co-founder will be crooked Hillary Clinton. End of quote. But radical compression and routine exaggeration are only one of the ways in which our political language is losing its explanatory power. Our concept of the role of authority, particularly of scientific authority, has become disordered in ways which impact on issues as varied as global warming, vaccine safety, and monetary policy. It's much harder for us to find a common language to engage with peoples and cultures whose values differ substantially from our own. And I believe there's a growing intolerance of free speech, not just in controlled societies, and there are many countries in the world where it's getting much, much worse, but also in Western countries who claim to venerate it. So, how do we get here, and what steps could we begin to take to put things right? Well, firstly, and there may well be people who in questions disagree with this, but I'm very suspicious of theories which want to place all the blame on one set of actors in this drama. It's very easy to demonise politicians and parties with whom you happen to disagree, but it doesn't explain why very similar changes are taking place in public discourse in radically different political settings and across different ideological polarities. one of the reasons that I came to write the book is in 2009 and 2010, I noticed that the left-wing critics of the attempt to reform the National Health Service under a Conservative-led government in the UK, so the Conservative government trying to do the reforms, essentially the unions and the left are against the reforms, they were using very similar tactics to the Conservative critics of Obamacare in this country. In the UK, they were trying to get the idea that any form of reform added up to privatisation, which is a very loaded term after Margaret Thatcher. It's a politically very, very explosive term. So any change would be privatisation. In the same way that in this country, Sarah Palin was trying to define, I begin my book with this, Obamacare with the single phrase, death panels. And indeed, one of the demonisations of Obamacare was the terrible danger that Americans would be subjected to a Soviet-style healthcare system like Britain's National Health Service. So what interested me was the fact that the politics were completely opposite, and yet the tactics and the attempt to find a single word, because the policy itself is so complicated and so difficult to explain and understand, much easier if you want to win a political fight, to go for a single word that you can kind of win the case with. And in both cases, the critics got some, in both cases the legislation went through ultimately, but the critics scored some real blows with very, very simple phrases. So anyway, for me, the loading of all the blame onto the political other isn't really a diagnosis of the problem, but more a symptom of the disease. I don't believe Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, when he left office in 2007, said he thought the principal culprits were the media. I certainly don't think that the media are kind of innocent bystanders. I mean, we've got our share of the blame, no doubt, but I think it's too simplistic to load it all onto the media. So for me, and I'll take you through them briskly, I think there are a set of interlocking political and cultural and technological forces. I think digital media plays a big part in it. And these things are operating together to begin to undermine the way we do political discourse, the way we talk about issues, the way we try and encourage voters to vote, and hopefully voters to vote with a clear idea about what they're voting for. The first factor is the changing character of Western politics. Previous affiliations, not long ago, politics could be clearly based on class, could be based on other kinds of traditional group identity, but that began to give way, particularly after the end of the Cold War, to a much more uncertain landscape in which politicians struggle for definition and differentiation. So many different kinds of way of being right-wing, many different kinds of way of being left-wing, often people claiming to be centrist. So a much more confused landscape. With policy platforms becoming more arguable, and with coalitions of interest more transient and more fragile, it's probably not surprising that political rhetoric has also become more divisive. And interestingly, because when party and group loyalties recede, the character of individual politicians matters more and more, it's become more personal. If you can't lock someone clearly into a particular ideological grouping, you say, so-and-so is our guy because I think like she does or he does. If you can't do that, you start asking questions much more about individual character. The second factor, Elizabeth referred to this, is what I think is the widening gulf between the worldview and the language of the experts who make modern policy and those of the public at large. Modern government is horribly complicated. It's necessarily technocratic. And precisely because so many advances have been made in Western societies, the trade-offs involved in any new policy proposal are likely to be much more finely balanced and more arguable than they were before. I'll give you a UK example. Britain decided to build a big airport outside London, Heathrow. Many of you will have been there. A decision quickly taken, the airport was opened up for a few years. There has been a battle going on for at least 10 years about whether the airport should have an extra runway. A third runway at Heathrow is proving to be 10 or 100 times harder to agree than having Heathrow in the first place. So it's much more complicated, And how do the experts go about it? Well, if you want to win an argument for a runway or against a runway, you need an army of lawyers, of planners, of economists, amassing evidence, creating vast bodies of data, both sides, and then they fight it out. Neither the technocrats nor the political ministers behind them seem to think it's really feasible, maybe not even desirable, to share this complexity with the public, to actually go through if you build the runway, the good news is maybe it's good for the national economy. The bad news is noise, pollution, a broader environmental impact and so on. How do you balance those things? That never happens in retail politics. The politicians prefer to have much, much simpler arguments. And as a result, often with important policy decisions, I think healthcare reform across the Western world is a good example. It's like there are two different kinds of discourse going on. One which is a very sophisticated evidence-based conversation between the kind of the Illuminati, the charmed circle of people who understand the issues and have got the time because they're professional to go through the detail. And a different discourse, much more instinct-based, much more emotional in the realm of retail politics. I think one way of thinking about the recent UK Brexit debate is as a clash between these two different modes of political discourse, and with the interesting result that the language of the professional policymakers came a very, very poor second. The next factor for me is digital technology and its impact both on pre-existing media, legacy institutions like the BBC and the New York Times and many others, but also on the wider dissemination and discussion of political ideas. Over the past 3 decades or so, technology has driven, as everyone here knows, an incredible expansion of media choice, and it's democratized the generation and dissemination of political opinion. It's also disrupted legacy business models, it's squeezed investment in newsrooms and in specialist journalistic expertise, and it's left most news publishers, whether they're venerable analog age institutions or digital startups, in a kind of economic survival mode, chasing audiences, trying to optimize headlines, courting shock and controversy. As a result, seriousness, restraint, a sense that journalists have a duty to make major public policy choices intelligible to the public, have all been in retreat. This is why it's so important that we find a strong and secure future for those journalistic institutions. As you heard, I've worked for 2 of them, the BBC and the New York Times, for those institutions which are the exception to the rule and who still try and put quality and seriousness first. The web and social media have obviously also allowed anyone who wants to take part in a new 24/7 worldwide discussion of politics, culture, and pretty much everything else. So it's an incredible opening up of information and opinion. But again, I think as most people know here, it's not all 24-karat gold. This opening up has also created a space, a kind of Pandora's box, for anonymous abuse, for extremism, for intimidation, and for fury. And I believe that social media and sometimes digital news sources also have the effect of accelerating news stories and accelerating the news cycle, so that, for example, a story which once people would have spent 24 or 48 hours trying to make sense of is being called. Is this a story about racial prejudice? Is it a story about the police defending themselves? Has a member of the police committed murder? These things are being discussed and often called and judged out there in the blogosphere within minutes. Sometimes it seems like seconds of the event happening. And this sense of extremity and of instant decision-making, instant judgment, and apparently the permissibility of using really rude, offensive, ugly, sometimes bullying language has spilt back into the conventional political sphere. So you hear politicians at the microphone making deeply personal, occasionally obscene remarks about each other in a way which would have been thought unthinkable 10, 20 years ago. I had the incredibly interesting experience of going to the Republican convention in Cleveland a few weeks ago, and although I thought I heard some very interesting and actually some very good speaking from the rostrum, it's fair to say that both in the convention hall and the shouting of the crowd, lock her up was the least of it, but also some of the crowds, rather small crowds must be said, but outside, and some of the kind of viciousness of some of the statements and some of the T-shirts felt like something new. I'm not suggesting that there was ever a Garden of Eden with a kind of happy world where politicians were always nice to each other and where the public always understood every single issue before they voted on it. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is we're seeing a step change in some of the difficulties we have in explaining ourselves. Let me go on to my fourth factor. If the changing nature of politics itself, if the technocratic nature of government and the kind of splitting between the technocrats and ordinary people and the way ordinary people speak, and then thirdly, the effect of digital on news media and on the dissemination of opinion, if those are my first causes, the fourth one, in a way, goes back in some ways to the origins of rhetoric, and it's about a development in our understanding of how persuasion works. And bear with me. In his Art of Rhetoric, still the best book written about rhetoric, Aristotle is writing about rhetoric 2,500 years ago. Because he's a genius, he pretty much nails it, in the sense that if you read this book, he's observed how human beings try and persuade each other in court, on the high street, in the assembly. And much of what he's got to say rings completely true today. Philosophers have got time. They argue carefully. They want to get to the argument, they want to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. Orators are in a hurry. The jury wants their lunch. We better finish the case. The assembly is getting restive. Let's cut to the chase, have the vote, our side will win. So they cut corners, and the cutting of corners is a really important thread all the way through the history, though I think it's getting much worse now. Orators exaggerate. If you're going to speak at somebody's funeral, you're not going to give them a balanced view of their good points and bad points. You're going to emphasize the good points. If you're trying to win a case, you're not, if you're the prosecution attorney, you're not going to, again, point out some of the mitigating circumstances for the accused. You're going to go for it. Your job is to go for it. So elementary and fundamentally but eternal truths about how human beings persuade each other, he's got them. He's got three kinds of rhetoric in his opinion, or at least the way he divides rhetoric up goes like this. There's deliberative rhetoric. That's political rhetoric. It's about how you discuss the big issues of the day, how you make decisions about the community as a whole. Forensic rhetoric. Forensic rhetoric is what you do in court. It's about how you do justice. His third category I want to call demonstrative rhetoric. And what he's got in mind is something like a commencement speech, or I just mentioned a speech at somebody's funeral. And this is really about promoting something. It's about celebrating something. Occasionally it's about criticizing something, but it's a kind of more celebratory thing. Now, he doesn't, because the term didn't exist, he doesn't associate it with what I'm about to say, but in my view, the main way in which what I'm calling demonstrative rhetoric plays out is in marketing, in the language of marketing. The most ubiquitous persuasive language in our world is the language of advertising and other forms of marketing. And what's interesting is that over the 20th century, there were a whole wave of extremely thoughtful, empirically based advances in our understanding about how words are used in sales and marketing. Began with informal trial and error. At the gasoline pump, it turns out if you say, how many gallons do you want, ma'am, you get a number. I'd like 2 gallons, I'd like 3 gallons. If you say, shall I fill her up? Most people say, sure, fill her up. So fill her up, tested out in the field, fill her up is a good way to start if you're trying to sell gasoline. So that's kind of trial and error. It moves on to much more systematic, quantitative and qualitative research. And today is a matter of algorithms, multivariate A/B testing, in ways which you must be, sometimes aware of, perhaps often are not. I'll give you one simple example, because all of these things got progressively imported into politics. Bernie Sanders is only one of the candidates in this presidential cycle to use something called Optimizely. And Optimizely essentially looks at a website and tests different versions. If you want people to sign up to the Bernie Sanders campaign or to make a donation, how big should the button be on the page? What colour should the button be? What should it say? You try lots of different versions of the button. But it doesn't stop there. There are headlines on this page, on the were on the Bernie Sanders page. The headlines are policies. The policies were tested. The headlines are tested. Which policies resonate and get the most number of clicks, which ones don't, and what expressions of the policies are the most effective. So at a very deep level, what's happening is machinery is being used invisibly, and you're not aware of it, to make it more persuasive. The persuasiveness is tested by how people respond, how often they click. It's used routinely now in commercial marketing. It's now become part of political marketing as well. And the clear, bright line you could once draw between political rhetoric and marketing has manifestly gone. So what can we do? The forces I've talked about, it's not as simple as saying if only the Republicans would grow up, or if only those Brexiters would just calm down. It's much more complicated than that. The forces also tend to reinforce each other. Those lessons from marketing tend to be go shorter, a smaller number of words, make the button bigger, make it simpler. So they have the effect of making the language the politicians want to use get simpler and simpler and simpler. Jobs, 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 the death panel, and so on. But I have my book ends on a fairly optimistic note. I believe that we are adaptable creatures. In the book, I talk quite a lot about history. There are some very interesting earlier examples of difficulty in public language. Thomas Hobbes in 17th century England thought he was living through a complete breakdown of public language, driven by extremists printing pamphlets calling for disorder. Hobbes is a hard man, and his recommendation, he writes in Behemoth, his history of the English Civil War, if only 10,000 seditious ministers had been shot or killed at the beginning of the thing, we wouldn't have had a civil war. So he believes in suppression of free speech. But he believes that what's interesting is pamphleting. This kind of people weren't used to pamphlets, and when they read pamphlets, they thought they must be true. Within a couple of generations, they got used to pamphlets. People didn't read them anymore. Who's going to read a political pamphlet? So I have a strong view that over time we adapt, and we know that we have to find ways of living together and of reaching decisions. It's just that we don't quite know when it's going to happen. Let me read the very end of the book to give you a sense of where I finish in my journey. The journey takes us in some ways all the way back to the Greeks, but essentially it was inspired by my observation of politics today, and it's fundamentally about the politics of today. But let me just read you the last couple of paragraphs. And I'll begin where I just left off. I give a series of rather more specific proposals for what we might do. And I finished really with the notion that teaching our children a bit more about rhetoric, about how to understand how persuasive language, persuasive imagery works, is probably the most important kind of civics we could teach them. I mean, the mechanics of how a law gets made, how the different branches of the US government work, that's important. But fundamentally, helping them to develop the critical faculties to understand the way these forces and how these invisible kinds of persuasion work, I think is really important. So I give a whole set of practical suggestions of what we might do. But I finish by saying none of these proposals or examples guarantees that our public language will pass the Trump test anytime soon. And by the Trump test, I mean basically, will ordinary voters be able to tell the difference between, anti-rhetorical, in the end, rather shallow or hollow language and the real thing. So, between a kind of false kind of, in quotes, authenticity and real truth-telling. So I say none of them will pass the Trump test soon. The forces of political fragmentation and digital disruption are still playing out. Many of the players are trapped in habits and responses that they will find hard to break, even if they want to. Perhaps, to put it simply, too much has been said in this frantically prolix world of ours, just too many hateful, mad, duplicitous words, and what we need now is a period of forgetting, a kind of general amnesty before we can even hope for a recovery. But let's not despair. Public language has come back to life before, sometimes even as the last rites were being read over it. Revival depends not on the victory of one ideology over another, nor on any deliberate call for reform, but on a turning of the tide of culture and society. We're commonsensical creatures. We know that our life together depends on our being able to resolve our differences, at least most of the time. Sooner or later, a new language of reasonable persuasion should emerge. We just don't know when. So what can we do in this long, uncertain interim? Open your ears. Use your own good judgment. Think, speak, laugh, cut through the noise. Thank you very much. No, that's what I want to say. Let's have some questions. I think there's a mic. I think Hubert's got a mic he's going to bring around. So we've got lots of questions.
I can do one without a mic.
I think they need a mic. They want a mic for the video. So it's. You'll be speaking to thousands.
Can I start here?
We're going to start. Okay.
And if you do raise your hand, and I come towards you, if you would come to the end of the aisle, that would help out. Okay.
Hello. Hi, my name's Melissa. I heard that you said you were talking about arguments that politicians have. And my question, I typed it up, does your book shed light onto the complications that different party politicians have in their proposals and their viewpoints? And in other words, do we get to hear through your book the complexity of their arguments on certain topics that are different than the one-liners that politicians currently try to tell the public audience in order for us to not understand them?
So I hope if you look at the book, I think what I try and do is I do try and take some examples of policy, and I try and take an example where, in a sense, I give some of the complexity of the actual issues at stake, and then show what the politicians said. What I would say, and I think Elizabeth made the point at the start, is that the paradox is there's never been a better moment to find out about public policy. The internet and libraries like this are a wonderful resource for finding out about policy. The trouble is most people don't do that, and it gets filtered through this political rhetoric, which often just doesn't tell you what's really at stake. Okay. Lady here.
Thank you.
And then there's the gentleman who doesn't need a mic, one row ahead.
Thank you. My name is Janice. I was struck by when you were naming 1, 2, 3, and 4. When you got to 2, and you're talking about the marketplace, that there's the incredible dichotomy between the professional politicians and then the rest of the marketplace. And I was struck. I said to my friend, I was struck by the fact that it seemed like you paid no lip service to the whole industry of the pundits. Because we have the people who go to Fox, and we have the people who go to MSNBC. But apart from that, we do have people sort of translating or trying to translate. I just heard today Kerry talking about sitting down with these horrible people who gas their people. Well, that's a public, what are you talking about? A press conference. But Don't you have a slot there in that area?
I didn't tonight because there wasn't space, but I'm very interested in the commentators. Yeah. And obviously, and it's a very traditional division, this, much talked about, but it still really matters, the fine line between fact and impartial judgment about the fact. So who's going to win the presidential election? I haven't got any sides. Who's going to win? And then opinion, and the way in which, particularly on cable TV and on the internet, competition for impact means that strong opinion has been gaining relative to dispassionate fact.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to just have you address the evolutionary nature of the changing rhetoric and whether it can be affected by dark money, large financial interests. For instance, there was a time when we would argue the specificity, though the capital gains rate should be 19 or 17. The Koch brothers would say, don't bother about that. Just say that government is bad, and then we'll take care of the rate when it gets to committee. You know, so does large financial interests speed up the evolutionary nature?
They can do, and I think that, I mean, in the 1990s, someone I know and indeed like, as a man called Frank Luntz, Dr. Frank Luntz, who's a Republican pollster and kind of specialist on language. And Frank Luntz recommended a couple of language changes. And Frank, working for the Republican Party or working for powerful interests, as a matter of professional advice, suggested the use of the word death tax for capital gains as an example, and recommended the use of the phrase climate change rather than global warming. And that was done, with focus groups and just figuring it out, and it was done as a piece of kind of engineered political language. But you go on to 2009, and Sarah Palin invents, that's what she told me in the email, invents the phrase death panel and puts it up on Twitter and Facebook on her own. And in a weird way, the whole of the internet then becomes the echo chamber. And I think what I want to say is, I think many people, if I can say broadly of the left, went into the presidential cycle kind of ready for the Koch brothers or other powerful interests to kind of, in quotes, buy the election by swamping the airways with attack ads against Hillary Clinton or whoever the Democrat candidate was, and support for the Republican candidate. The weird thing is what a small role television advertising has played so far in this story. The internet, the viral quality of the way people get information, the fascinating conjunction of someone who may not be a trained politician, but my God, is a trained reality TV star, with a natural affinity for 24/7 digital media, which costs nothing. And I think the interesting thing about the present is, in a way, a lot of the big money is not in the race because they can't work out where to spend it at the moment. But I'm not suggesting that there aren't many powerful interests on right and left who are playing a part. But I think, in a weird way, I think we are seeing, in some ways, a more democratized process. But a democratized process does not always mean you get the result you want.
Okay.
Hey, Mark. Thanks so much for your time today. I had a question about technology. If technology and social media is amplifying the pace that things are going, split testing, all that sort of stuff on websites, where is the crescendo? Do we eventually get so numb to it that we're just saying they're all incongruent and we all take a step back, or what happens? Where does that sort of end, that growth?
Well, I mean, the wonderful, was it Kierkegaard who said, history is written backwards, but has to be lived forwards. we don't know. I mean, I think we shouldn't. Although it often feels, when things seem to be disintegrating, that they're going to get worse and worse and worse. And frankly, in history, sometimes that broadly turns out to be right. I have a strong sense that we're kind of getting used to all sorts of different kinds of media. That the role of the smartphone in every pocket, of of an ability to go online 24/7 so easily, you hardly are aware you're doing it. And the exposure to these sort of ideas and these kind of sudden rushes of stories and phrases, at the moment we find very hard to understand and manage and make sense of, and therefore they have a very big influence, not on everyone, but on many people, many voters. I think probably it'll normalise, and we'll just won't take it so seriously. In the same way that, for years and years and years, most people ignored most advertising and only looked at the advertising they found interesting. You don't even see the rest.
Can I? I'll try to come back to you. I'm concentrating too much on one area of the room, so let me help some other. Oh, okay.
That was kind of harsh.
Hello. My name's Jackson. This is for you, by the way.
Thank you.
I was listening to what you were saying. I noticed you touched on the suppression of freedom of speech.
Yeah.
You also touched on globalization.
Yeah.
And I see the election as a large theme. But anyway, with the United States' notorious violations of human rights just throughout history, and the schism that they seem to be having with the Russian parliament, and also you mentioned Brexit, which happened around the same time that Joe Cox, a minister over there, was assassinated by someone with connections to a group over here.
Yep.
Do you see where they're using media and the suppression of freedom of speech for some other goal aside from just money, but securing some kind of authority or power over a specific, I guess, angle of society or group of people?
So let me. This is a gigantic topic we can't do justice to right now. I mean, for what it's worth, look, everyone will have their view about this. I've watched this, and I've reported out of a lot of controlled societies, the old USSR and China and elsewhere. My sense about what motivates governments most towards censorship and the suppression of free speech is fear of losing control. The single thing that makes them, behind that is a distrust of the public and the fear that the public will not react sensibly. So in the UK, there's been a very big debate. It's happening across Europe, and I think it's been less present in the US, but it's probably here as well, about should radical Islamic speakers be banned from speaking? Should they just not be allowed to speak? In particular, not allowed to speak to young people, because maybe the young people will get radicalized if they hear the radical Islamic clerics and other speakers. I think it's a really dangerous road. I think this road of trying to suppress something, look, I'm not going to say there aren't limits. I think if someone is trying to actively recruit terrorists, there comes a point where it becomes a crime, and they should be arrested. But make it an arrestable crime. I'm very worried about not letting young people and the public at large judge for themselves. And I think if you want to beat, if you are a in quotes moderate Muslim, or you are someone who believes that terrorism is a terrible thing, most people do, argue that in public. Don't try and suppress it. So I would say, you can debate, frankly, almost every Western country and its enemies, I mean Russia and China, on freedom of speech. I think that the kind of tendency in many countries of the world, the United States being, I think, a significant exception to this, to try and tighten controls on freedom of speech is about fear, and it's dangerous. It's another problem. It's another way in which our public language is at risk. I mean, because in the end, the most fundamental risk is stopping debate happening. And I would say, and people may disagree with this, certainly in the UK, but I think here as well, that for decades, many mainstream politicians thought that there should not be too much of a conversation about immigration, that it would be dangerous, and that maybe if you stop the conversation happening, fears about immigration would go away. That's not the way human nature works. If you've got something you're worried about, and elite politicians tell you not to talk about it, and they won't talk about it, it doesn't go away, it builds. It becomes more and more frustrating to you. So to me, I mean, I think in a democracy we should try and figure out a way of talking publicly together about everything.
Hi. I'm one of those people who have I have a guilty pleasure of going on Google News and like I'll just click on something, or I won't even click on it, just read it. And I'll go through it and I won't get anything from the article. And then when I do click it and I do read it, it's like I don't feel satisfied of what I got from it. So one of the things is that like the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, whether you're listening to Fox News or for Bill Maher or whatever, I think one of the things that we tend to, or what I tend to do, is not believe anything anybody says. Yeah. And so, and that's a way to protect myself. And I sort of deal with a lot of people that are uneducated in my profession. And so when you say at the end of your book where rhetoric requires critical thinking, some people don't have that ability to do the critical thinking. And I'm going to make the case to you, being a straight and atheist, is that, look, there's something to be said about religion and morality and ethics, that I think that's why we don't believe people anymore, is because we don't really see an outcome. We see rhetoric, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. But it's been years since the Bush administration and we haven't really seen anything present. And I think that's one of the things that everyone's frustrated, that I meet, people who want Trump or who don't want Trump, or who love Hillary, don't want Hillary. They're like, well, there's nothing. So
this takes us into very deep water. It's really interesting. One of the concepts I talk about in the book, another Greek concept, is practical wisdom. And the idea of practical wisdom, it's kind of common sense. I'm slightly suspicious about the phrase common sense, but let's call it practical wisdom. Or prudence is another word for it. The idea is that human beings have got this innate judgment. They can make judgment. How do we know we believe in this? We have jury justice. We have justice by juries. The concept of a jury is you can take 12 ordinary people, expose them to the evidence, expose them to the rival arguments in court, and those people will come up with a fair verdict. If you think about it, jury trial is a profound belief in and indeed democracy. Democracy is based really, you can sort of argue it's a social justice. It's partly based on the idea that if you ask the people at large to think about an issue, they'll come up with the right answer. Now, the really interesting question, and so this goes back, Plato didn't really believe in practical wisdom. Aristotle does a bit more. Thomas Hobbes didn't believe in it. There's a debate through history about, can you really trust people? If you believe in dumbing down, you probably have got a fairly low view about people's practical wisdom. You're worried that if they're left to look and watch anything, they will, and that people will pander to the lowest common denominator. Now, as it happens, I can't tell you if you're pretty skeptical about whether people can be trusted, and in the end, if we really work through issues, we'll come up with the right answer. But I do, and I quote, there's a passage from Pericles, the great Greek political leader, and it's from the great speech, it's the other great funeral speech, the Athenian war dead speech from Pericles. It's got some similarities with the Lincoln Gettysburg Address. And he talks about democracy. He says, the thing about we Athenians is even ordinary people are interested in public policy. And we talk about it together. And we only act when we've talked together. And we make decisions based on our common understanding of the issue. Other people think that talking gets in the way of action. We think if you act without talking, you make the wrong decision. So that's an expression of a certain view, but it's not the only view, and there are many people in history and plenty of people in the book who think you're right. Essentially, that in the end, there's nothing there.
Hi. So you touched a little bit on the fact that there's so many different experts on both sides. As a journalist, what do you suggest, or what do you view as a credible source, given the fact that there's so many different sources out there for us to get our information from? Oftentimes they lean a certain way or another way.
That's right. Well, I think it would be really helpful, and I think because it sounds a bit boring, I don't think we do it often enough, is to tell the public, whether it's the people reading the New York Times or the people watching CNN, tell the people the background of this expert. Is this a right-wing think tank, a left-wing think tank? So the first thing is, let's position our expert and give some sense of how people should think about the expert. I mean, my view is that political opinions, are not just valid, they're essential. I mean, the stuff of politics is, so there's nothing wrong with opinion, but let's make sure we understand whether an expert is there to talk about facts, to try and give people an understanding of fact, or whether they're there to express an opinion. And I'm quite critical of experts who, even if it's for the best of intentions, start trying to blur the line. And a really good example is climate change. I'm one of those people, I personally find the scientific evidence that the globe is warming and that there's a very high probability that human activity is responsible for the warming. I find that very compelling. I don't think that climate skeptics should get the same amount of airtime or column inches as the scientists who actually know about global warming. I think it's a scientific matter. But I worry a lot about the tactics employed by the climate skeptics. I certainly worry about that. I also worry when some of the scientists start sounding like political advocates. I don't think they help their case. If you want a politician, believe me, there's a lifelong supply of them over here. It's the objectivity of scientists which is so precious. So I would say label the experts, and for the experts themselves, try and make sure the experts understand. If you're an expert witness, be an expert witness. Don't start trying to also tell people what to do. There's a lady here. No. Oh, okay, we'll come to you next. Go for it.
Hi. There's been a lot of comment how polarized the media has become. Michael Goodwin is a columnist for the New York Post, has written many columns about this, and he says, and I see it too, that it's almost complete. I mean, you name a paper, New York Times included, on one side, Wall Street Journal maybe on the other, there is nobody left that's objective in the media. Would you agree with that?
Well, what I would say about both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, if you turn to the opinion pages of both newspapers, you'll definitely get a flavour of a liberal flavour in the first case, conservative in the second. Both papers would claim that in their reporting of the news, in the news pages and the headlines, they're trying to report the facts. And I'm not saying, my view about impartial reporting of the facts is it's an aspiration. It's something we all try and do. Well, sorry, it's something newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal try and do. We don't always succeed. But I would say that as long as you, again, it's a bit like the expert point, if you separate clearly what is news, what are the facts you're trying to report, and then let's have a debate about the opinion, as long as it's clear. I agree with that. And I think sometimes when we make mistakes because of a world view which sees the world one way and doesn't see this is actually a story. I agree with that. This lady here. And we'll finish in just a couple of minutes.
I hope I'm misunderstanding you, because I thought I heard you say that to trust people. And we had a war called an invasion in Iraq, and you had a whole, the media is supposed to be the fourth estate. I guess, you had a whole media who laid down. I mean, they just laid down. And I know because I follow these things. And I don't care if it's Charlie Rose on NPR. He had Jonathan Schell. That's it. He had one person against the war. The rest of them, I don't care what. Peter Jennings one night, he says to a professor who was on the news there talking to Peter Jennings, and this guy was from Iraq, and he was saying how this country would run red with blood. And Peter Jennings says to the man, "Professor, do you have any knowledge as to how we came to talk to you?" So I can't, surely I misunderstood you about saying what you're saying about that, that the people can make the choices. Surely I misunderstood.
What I'm saying is, I'm not sure whether you misunderstood. Let me have another go.
Because you were saying juries too.
So the thing is, you can believe in trial by jury and still also believe that sometimes juries will make mistakes. You can absolutely believe that. And democracies can make terrible mistakes. In other words, I think nobody, unless they're crazy, believes that the practical wisdom of the public at large is infallible. It's more that it's the best shot we've got. That in the end, we would rather have a system where serious criminal trials were judged by a jury of the peers, of the equals of the accused, rather than given, as they are in some countries, to a handful of judges. So it's really about putting the greater reliance on this than on other. Plato didn't want the public to decide. In the Republic, he's got he's got an elite deciding everything. So that's what that argument's about. War, there's a whole chapter about war. War is the most difficult topic, it seems to me, when you come and talk about rhetoric. The arguments which are made for going to war, some of the arguments sometimes made against war, are the most difficult arguments of all. And I'm particularly interested in cover in great detail the story of Iraq and the coverage of Iraq, both in the US and in the UK, and the questions of how do pretexts and how do partial claims sometimes turn out to be decisive, even in cases where they lead to wars which go very badly wrong. So I certainly don't believe you should trust all politicians, by the way. I'm certainly not recommending that. What I'm saying is that in the end, democracy, for me, not for everyone, for me, is probably the best way we've got of choosing who should govern us. Now, one more question, and then we should end.
Oh, my brain's exploding because there's like 1,000 things that you've been talking about. But how does how you feel about this rhetoric affect how your journalists cover this year's campaign? Because I have to tell you, I have done some reporting myself, and I go out there and I say to the people at the Trump rallies, what do you think about his policy on whatever it is? He's going to give us jobs. He's going to build a wall. Yeah. And the gentleman over there talking about it's the easy answer. Nobody has to think about it. And so these are the answers you get.
Well, I want to say, if Dean Baquet, the executive editor, and his colleagues were here today, I mean, if I can speak on their behalf, firstly, facts and context really matter. And we should, and I think over particularly in recent months, we've been getting more clear-cut about this. Last week, very unusually, on its lead story, the New York Times said that Donald Trump had said a lie, which was about the origin of the birther myth about Barack Obama. And not on an opinion page, but in a news story, we said that was a lie, that it was something which was not true, and the fact that it was not true was so widely known that Donald Trump must have known that when he said it. So I think the first thing is call it out. If something is inconsistent, if you said you were in favor of the Gulf War, the war in Iraq at the time, don't claim now that you said you weren't in favor. So inconsistencies and untruths should be called out. So the first thing is we've got to do our best to put the actual facts in front of the public. Secondly, we should try and help with the context of public policy, even if the candidates don't.
Or even if the people listening, that the people who are going to these rallies that are supporting Trump, they're not reading the New York Times.
Well,
No offense.
no, it's very.
And I don't want to get in a fight with you because you're
Can I say?
the rhetoric.
I'm kind of big as well. Can I say that we shared, it's rather entertaining, it's like a situation comedy premise. We shared a hotel at the Republican convention, the elite, the editor, myself at the New York Times, with the Oklahoma delegation to the Republican conference. We got on like a house on fire, actually. But and some of them do read the New York Times. No, but look, obviously.
The New York Times isn't exactly considered liberal.
Well, not by some, certainly. Yeah. That's right.
Hello.
But what I want to say is, of course, you've got an issue, particularly when you've got a candidate who has presented himself as a non-politician, who is against not just elite mainstream politics, but against elite mainstream media. His supporters want to believe him and believe his story rather than all of elite media. And that's right now, it's a central fact in the current presidential cycle. What I'd hope over time, one thing I do miss in America, in the UK, the BBC is watched or listened to by about 90% of the population. Most of them listen for, the average is I think more than 15 hours a week. So 90%. Everyone has to listen to people who disagree with them. You can't help but bump into other people's opinions. And one thing, I would love at the New York Times, more generally in American media, is to find places where everyone is confronted with opinions they disagree with. It's very healthy. And the terrible danger of the internet is of self-reinforcement. You only go to the areas and to the subjects and the journalists who you happen to think are right.
So when Megyn Kelly says something that's not the party line, everybody goes berserk.
Yeah.
But,
So
We would love to have the BBC here all the time.
yeah, to be fair, it's available on the internet.
I know.
Look, can I just say, in particular, to all the questioners, thank you so much for such thoughtful, intelligent, and passionate questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes.
Thank all of you.
Thank you. And I think the discussion here tonight and all the questions gives you some idea of the richness of the ideas and the complexity of the discussion that goes on in Enough Said, and I can't recommend it highly enough. And thank you so much for a wonderful talk here this evening, Mr. Thompson.